Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture on witchcraft and sorcery. So, I'll give you a chance to just look at the outline a little bit. I'm going to cover some basic approaches to these topics here from anthropology, and the first is to just note that we actually distinguish in anthropology between witchcraft and sorcery. Witchcraft is the belief that's held around the world that there are people who are inherently evil and can cause harm to others through mostly psychic means. In other words, through mental means, non-physical means, even without intending to do so. Sorcery, on the other hand, is what in English we tend to call black magic. So sorcery is a magical technique or ritual aimed at harming or influencing others. It's intentional. And where you find belief in sorcery, anyone can be a sorcerer if they learn the appropriate means, the spells and incantations and whatever it is. So these are two slightly different ways of talking about doing magical or psychic harm to somebody else. In this class, we have encountered some common interpretations of witchcraft. So, for example, the idea that witchcraft serves social function. If you think about the fact that, if your neighbors might be witches, you might want to treat them well, because if you treat them poorly and they are witches, they could really hurt you. So there's an incentive there to act correctly, or to act in a social manner, in a way that conforms to the norms and the expectations of the people around you. Another way to look at this is that if you're a grumpy, asocial type person who likes to break the norms and aggravate people, well, people around you might decide you're a witch, and they could harm you for that, as we know from history. And so if you don't want to be accused of being a witch and suffering the consequences, then maybe you might just want to be a good, friendly, and in general conforming kind of person. So the argument here is that witchcraft beliefs kind of encourage people to conform and to do what's expected of them in their context. And that's a social function or a functionalist approach to witchcraft. A variant of this approach, but one that's a lot less rosy, says that witchcraft accusations can actually reinforce inequality between people. So the idea here is that they may help society to function, but the cost is that they reinforce inequalities between different groups. And this interpretation of witchcraft is mostly based on the European experience, and it notes that the accused witches were often older women living alone, like widowers, or people who we used to call spinsters, in other words, women who never married. And if you think about it, in a patriarchal society where many different aspects of patriarchy, just to mention a few that are relevant here, a woman is defined by who she is by the men in her life. So as a woman, you're defined by who your father is, who your brothers are. You're defined by who your husband is. Also in a patriarchal society, we tend to see women as under the authority of men. In that kind of society, the idea of a woman surviving on her own without men is a threat to the social order. How can this be? How is this woman able to survive on her own without the protection of men? And where does she derive her identity from and her value if she's not attached to a man? So it could be that the perception of this threat to patriarchal order inspired witchcraft accusations against women who were living alone for a long period, like women whose husbands had died or women who chose to never marry. So in this sense, witchcraft might not really be an incentive for good behavior, but more of a tool to enforce social conformity and to reinforce the patriarchal power structure, which essentially promotes men to the highest positions of power in society. In other words, it's punishing those independent women by calling them witches and potentially harming or killing them. This interpretation has some affinity with Marxism, which we've covered, because it focuses on the way a cultural belief might reinforce inequality. In other words, it sees witchcraft as an ideology, a belief that reinforces inequality, although in this case it is not class inequality, but rather inequality between men and women that we're talking about. But there is actually also a Marxist argument about European witchcraft that Winsler talks about, and he talks about how there's this interpretation that witchcraft in Europe was actually class conflict, and so you can look at that yourself for more. Just to remind you again, another approach we've covered, the sociological approach, the idea that witchcraft is the expression of other social phenomena. In an earlier reading, we saw that some authors argued that the Salem witchcraft accusations actually didn't function to do anything, but they were really an expression of social and political conflicts in the Salem community. And the idea was that these families that were in conflict didn't have a lot of ways to express that conflict. And so it came out in this culturally acceptable religious form. It bubbled to the surface, if you will, in the form of witchcraft accusations. So this reminds us that, perhaps nobody's standing around a cauldron chanting spells. Maybe it's all just people's imaginations running wild. So there's nobody doing witchcraft, but witchcraft accusations are real, and they can tell us something important about what's happening among the people we're talking about. So that way of looking at it kind of shifts the focus from who are the witches and what are they doing, because they might not exist, but we know that the accusations are real, so we can study the accusations for what they tell us about society. And then finally, the idea that witchcraft is a form of explanation is another interpretation, and we looked at the Azandi case in some detail, and the idea that they use witchcraft to help explain misfortune, like the reason a particular person was killed by a collapsing granary. And this was something that we covered when we looked at Evans Pritchard's ideas. Shifting a little bit, another way to study witchcraft is to try and look and discern where and why these beliefs, especially the accusations of witchcraft, persist. Why do we keep accusing people of witchcraft? And one answer to this question focuses on the tendency for witchcraft accusations to persist and even increase in times of social change. So in other words, people have noticed when things are changing, witchcraft accusations seem to increase. For example, Winsler presents some evidence that the so-called European witch craze actually didn't occur at the height of the Dark Ages. It occurred as Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages, and it coincided with the decline of traditional aristocratic and church authority. Those two things were threatened by the rise of science and capitalism, and by growing trade and urbanization. So, at that time, with all those changes happening, the witch craze occurs. And so the argument here is that it's not really, the witch craze at that time in Europe is not really the result of people's ignorance. Actually, it's a reaction against change, and it could have actually been inspired, perhaps not consciously even, but it could have been inspired by those forces in the church and in the traditional aristocracy who were starting to lose out. In other words, the forces that controlled the old order of medieval Europe were starting to lose ground, and that one of the reactions you saw was to attack and lash out and to make these witchcraft accusations as a way to deal with that decline in traditional authority. So again, it's not so much were witches real or not? Who knows? In fact, we don't have a lot of evidence that anybody was doing anything that looked like witchcraft, but we have a lot of evidence about people being accused and tried and murdered, in fact, executed for being supposedly witches. The idea that witchcraft accusations flourish in contexts that are marked by change actually has a lot of evidence from other parts of the world. So, for example, there have been studies of contemporary African witchcraft accusations. And the argument that some scholars have made is that those witchcraft accusations in different parts of Africa often come from uncertainty and nervousness about change. About the fact that, for example, The economy of South Africa has changed a lot in the last 50 years, and that the rise of capitalism, the growing instability of the capitalist economy, people responded to those changes not with less magic and religion, but actually with more. And that one way that people have responded is to struggle against the uncertainties of modern life through witchcraft, so that witchcraft accusations become a way for people to lash out at people who they see as at fault, people who are different, people who are nonconforming, sometimes women, but also sometimes men, who are seen as a threat, as a way to deal with all of these other changes that are happening in society. So again, like the Dark Ages, it's not so much that witchcraft comes from ignorance. No, it actually comes from nervousness and fear about change. We can broaden these observations out even further, and we can look at other parts of the world. The place where I've spent a lot of work in a lot of time in Thailand is actually a place that's also changed rapidly over the last 40 or 50 years. And in fact, there has been a renewal of certain practices there, like spirit mediumship. Now, spirit mediumship is not witchcraft. Spirit mediums are people who channel spirits of the dead to deliver predictions to their clients. But in a very unstable political and economic environment in Thailand, what better way to figure out where the future is headed than to appeal to the spirit world and to go to a spirit medium who can channel a spirit, who can tell you, okay, this is what you should do to deal with these, hard inequalities and tough uncertainties that you're facing. So I think that there's a kind of sensible explanation for why spirit mediumship, witchcraft accusations, and these other practices are more common when things are changing. And finally, I just want to say that I think another present-day application of the anthropological study of witchcraft is actually fundamentalism, both Christian and Muslim fundamentalism. One of the interesting things about fundamentalists is that they claim to be going back to the basics of their religion, but if you actually look at fundamentalism closely, it's very innovative, and it involves new interpretations of both the Christian and the Muslim traditions that actually break from the traditions of the past. So this is a long story that you can look into more yourself, but basically scholars of fundamentalism have argued that these movements are united by one thing, and that's a reaction against the modern world, and the perception that the modern world is a threat to either the belief in the Trinitarian God of the Christian tradition or Allah of the Muslim tradition. Ironically then, without modernity, without the modern world and all of its changes and instabilities, we'd have no fundamentalism. Just like in Covington, you saw this kind of argument where he argued that the New South and its changes and its urbanization and industrialization, that was the inspiration for snake handling. Not something from the past, it's something new. And so I think that this is a helpful way to understand where many different kinds of fundamentalism are coming from. So this is all kind of an argument that religion is something that's likely to persist and stay with us for a long time, because people are seeking explanations, they're seeking meaning in the world, and when the world is rapidly changing, the need for meaning and explanation only gets more urgent. Finally, I want to say that Windsor does have a discussion of the modern pagan movement in England and the U.S., and that is actually something else entirely. So when we talk about witchcraft accusations, we're not really talking about neo-paganism. Neo-paganism is a real religious tradition, and you can learn more about it in a variety of places. The last question I want to leave you with is, who are our witches today in the U.S.? And by this I mean that we have recently experienced what you could call witch crazes of a sort, in which people have been targeted for supposedly antisocial behavior, but then turned out to be innocent of wrongdoing. What am I talking about here? We'll take that up on the online discussion, hopefully, and we'll hear more about that. So I will see you there.